There is a mansion in Dresden, Germany that holds a dark secret. Its most famous resident was Friedrich Paulus, the German Field Marshal who lost the single biggest battle in human history. After the conflict, he lived there as a prisoner in a gilded cage, watched by the Stasi every minute of every day. But when he passed away, his home was sealed. What many overlooked was why. Decades later, whispers emerged of what the agents found inside, a disturbing collection of private notes that Paulus was never supposed to have, revealing a truth about his capture that changes everything. The secret of Object Terrace. What Stasi agents found inside that sealed mansion sent shockwaves all the way to Moscow. The house itself was already a fortress. You see, Paulus wasn't living in quiet retirement. He was in a gilded cage. The Stasi had watched him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The villa, a grand pre-war structure overlooking the Elbe River, was a lonely island in a city still clawing its way back from total ruin. Only 12 years earlier, Dresden had been a sea of fire. Now in 1957, it was a showcase for the new East German state, but the scars were everywhere. And in this city of ghosts, Paulus was the most famous one. The Stasi, the new secret police, were obsessed with him. They called his home Object Terrace, a code name that marked it as a high-priority surveillance target. And their surveillance was, to put it mildly, total. We're talking about a level of paranoia that is hard to even imagine today. The wow factor of Stasi methods was their thoroughness. They had dozens of microphones, codenamed Bologna, hidden inside the thick plaster walls. Agents in a nearby building listened in shifts, logging every sound. They even had vibration sensors, designed to pick up conversations by measuring the rattles in a window pane. The gardener who tended the roses was a Stasi informant. The cook who prepared his meals reported on his mood and his appetite. The driver who took him on state-approved errands was a Stasi major. They treated him like a piece of state property, a symbol to be managed. They knew he was sick. Paulus was dying from a brutal nerve disorder, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. It's a disease that attacks the body but leaves the mind perfectly sharp. The Stasi reports, which were later uncovered, coldly document his decline. They note how his handwriting was becoming shaky, how he had trouble lifting a teacup, and they knew he was writing. He spent almost all of his final 2 years at his heavy oak desk in the main study. His watchers assumed he was writing a simple, state-approved memoir, a final confession of his conversion from a fascist general to a supporter of the new socialist East Germany. They expected to find a manuscript praising his Soviet educators and condemning his former leader, Hitler. This was the narrative he was supposed to provide, but what they found was something else entirely. After the house was sealed, a specialized team was brought in from Berlin. These were not local police. These were Stasi archive specialists, the men who handled politically sensitive materials. Their orders were to find everything Paulus had written. For days, they moved room by room. They cataloged the library filled with military history books. They checked the furniture. They pulled up floorboards. At first, they found nothing unusual, just the predictable items of a retired officer. But then in the main study, an agent noticed something. Behind a massive floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelf, the wood paneling didn't quite line up. It was almost invisible, hidden in the shadows. When they pushed the heavy bookshelf aside, they found it. It wasn't a modern safe. It was a small, hidden space, a dark void built into the original 19th century frame of the house. A dead space the Stasi's microphone installers had completely missed. Inside this secret compartment, the air was stale and dry, and it was packed full. There were several large, heavy bundles meticulously wrapped in oilskin cloth and tied with twine. This was no simple diary. This was a trove, a hidden archive. The agents who opened the packages were reportedly stunned into silence. According to the few classified reports that were leaked decades later, they found thousands of pages of handwritten notes. This wasn't the approved memoir. This was a secret log, a counter-history. There were operational maps of the Battle of Stalingrad, but they were covered in new, shaky annotations in red and blue ink. Paulus had reanalyzed the entire battle, adding his private thoughts. There were dozens of drafts of letters written to his wife and children who were living in West Germany. These letters were filled with pain, regret, and a bitterness that was completely absent from the official letters the Stasi had let him send. But the most disturbing and politically explosive finds were two specific files. The first was a thick bundle of notes titled Moscow, 1943 to 1953. It wasn't a story of re-education and kindness. It was a cold, hard, analytical breakdown of the psychological games the Soviets had played on him. He named the Soviet officers, he detailed their interrogation methods, and, most dangerously, he described what he really thought of his supposed conversion to communism. To put it mildly, the document suggested he had been playing a long con, a double game, against his captors all along. The second find was even worse. It was a file he had labeled the Stalingrad Protocol. This was a secret, moment-by-moment operational log he had apparently kept hidden since 1943. It detailed his frantic, desperate radio messages to Hitler, begging for permission to break out of the Soviet encirclement. And it detailed Hitler's replies, which became more and more unhinged, demanding that he and his army perish. This file was pure political dynamite. For the Soviets, it was a massive problem. It proved Paulus wanted to surrender, and it hinted that his capture was less of a heroic battlefield victory and more of a negotiated deal to save his own skin. For the East Germans, it was a complete disaster. Their prized national symbol of a reformed fascist was in reality a man who had kept a secret, damning record of both his old and new masters. The Stasi chief in Dresden reportedly made a single frantic phone call to Berlin. The materials were immediately designated as top-secret state importance. They were not even cataloged on site. They were packed into sealed wooden crates, loaded onto an unmarked military truck in the dead of night, and driven directly to a special Stasi vault in Berlin-Hohenschönhausen. And then, for all intents and purposes, they vanished. The house on Pressstrasse was sanitized. The hidden compartment was plastered over and painted. The official inventory of Paulus's estate listed only personal effects, state-given furniture, and military history books. The disturbing, complicated truth was buried. To understand why these papers were so dangerous, you have to understand the man who wrote them. You have to go back to the single moment his entire world ended in a frozen, windswept wasteland over 2,000 miles away. What they found was a second history of the war. But the real question was, what did it say about both sides? The end at Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, General Friedrich Paulus was, to put it mildly, on top of the world. He was the commander of the German 6th Army, a massive elite force of over 300,000 men. These weren't just any soldiers. This was the army that had smashed through France, that had conquered the Balkans, that was seen as truly invincible. Paulus himself was the model of a perfect German officer, brilliant, meticulous, and completely loyal. He was a staff officer by trade, a man who built perfect plans on paper. Now he was at the head of the most powerful army on earth, and they had one single massive objective. They were driving deep into southern Russia, part of Case Blue, the grand plan to seize the oil-rich Caucasus region. But to do that, they had to secure one city on the Volga River, a city that had become a personal obsession for both Hitler and his rival, Stalin. The city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Hitler wanted it erased from the map. He saw it as the symbolic heart of his enemy. What many overlooked was the strategic value. If Paulus took Stalingrad, he would cut off the main supply route for the Red Army and open the door to the oil fields. The conflict would be over. The battle for Stalingrad was supposed to be finished in weeks. Instead, it became a grinding, brutal nightmare that lasted for 5 months. The Soviets, led by the ferocious General Vasily Chuikov, refused to give up. They had a simple motto: there is no land behind the Volga. They fought for every single building, every floor, every pile of rubble. The city, which stretched for over 30 miles along the river, became a meat grinder. The Sixth Army, built for sweeping, fast-moving warfare, was drawn in deeper and deeper into a close-quarters urban hell they called Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. Then the unthinkable happened. The Soviets, who the Germans thought were broken, launched a massive secret counterattack. On November 19, 1942, as the bitter Russian winter set in, the Red Army unleashed Operation Uranus. A wow factor of this plan was its sheer scale. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces. They didn't attack the city itself. They attacked the weak Romanian and Italian armies that were guarding the Sixth Army's flanks. The Allied forces crumbled. In just 4 days, the Soviet armored columns punched through, raced across the frozen plains, circled around, and linked up. The trap snapped shut. Paulus, his entire Sixth Army, and parts of another army, nearly 300,000 men, were surrounded. They were trapped in a frozen pocket of land, a kessel or cauldron, with their backs to the Volga. What many overlooked is just how dire the situation was and how fast it fell apart. The winter that year was one of the worst in a century. Temperatures plunged to 30, then 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The Sixth Army had no winter clothing. They were still in their summer uniforms. They had few supplies and no way of getting more. Fuel ran out, turning their tanks into useless steel coffins. Food disappeared. Men were reduced to eating their pack horses, then dogs, then rats. Bread was made with sawdust. Hermann Goering, the head of the German Air Force, made a wild, arrogant promise to Hitler. He said he could supply the entire army from the air. It was a complete and total fantasy. The Sixth Army needed a bare minimum of 750 tons of supplies a day just to survive. On its best, most heroic day, the air bridge delivered less than 100 tons. Many planes crashed, shot down by the tightening ring of Soviet anti-aircraft guns. Paulus, the careful, meticulous staff officer, saw the truth in his ledgers. His army was starving. His men were perishing in the snow. Medical supplies were gone. Thousands of men lay in frozen basements, dying from frostbite, typhus, and dysentery. He began sending frantic, desperate messages to Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in Prussia. He pleaded, begging for permission to break out, to gather his remaining forces, his last few tanks, and punch a hole through the Soviet ring to escape. Hitler's response was simple and absolute. Hold at all costs. The city must be held. Surrender is not an option. A final desperate relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was launched in December. Another German general, von Manstein, tried to fight his way into the pocket. He got within 30 miles. Paulus's men could see the flares of the rescue force on the horizon. But Paulus, obeying his orders to hold the city, refused to break out to meet them. The rescue failed. The last hope was gone. By January 1943, the situation was hopeless. The Soviets had squeezed the Kessel into 2 tiny frozen pockets. Paulus and his command staff were huddled in the basement of a ruined department store, the Univermag. Above them, the city was a silent graveyard of 30,000 frozen German bodies. On January 30th, 1943, Paulus received one final bizarre radio message from Hitler. He was being promoted to the rank of Field Marshal. This wasn't an honor. It was a dark, cynical command. You see, the wow factor here is that in the entire history of Germany, no field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was sending a clear, unambiguous message to Paulus. Do the honorable thing. End your own life. But Paulus, staring at the ruins of his army, surrounded by his starving, half-mad staff, made a decision that would change history forever. He was a professional soldier, but he was also a devout Catholic. He would not end his life for a leader he now realized was detached from all reality. The next day, January 31st, a Soviet patrol, stunned, walked into the basement of the department store. They found a gaunt, broken, and trembling man in a dirty uniform. It was the new field marshal. Friedrich Paulus surrendered. He became the highest-ranking German officer ever captured alive. To Hitler, he was the ultimate traitor, a coward who had failed his nation. To his surviving soldiers, he was the man who had followed orders for too long and then surrendered them to a new hell. And to the Soviets, he was the ultimate prize. They didn't just capture a man, they captured a symbol, and they had very, very big plans for him. His old life was over. His new, strange life as a puppet was about to begin. A traitor in Nuremberg. When Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was taken into Soviet custody, he wasn't thrown into a frozen Siberian gulag with his men. What many overlooked is that the Soviets were far smarter than that. Paulus was a propaganda weapon of immense value. He was immediately separated from his surviving soldiers, 91,000 of whom were marched off to camps, with only 5,000 ever returning. Paulus instead was taken to a comfortable guarded dacha, a country house at a secure camp, number 27 near Moscow. He was given warm clothes, good food, medical care, and even a personal assistant. This wasn't kindness. It was a cold, careful calculation. For the first year, Paulus refused to cooperate. He was a defeated soldier, but in his mind, he was still a field marshal. He insisted he was loyal to Germany and would not speak against his country. He spent his days in quiet isolation, reading and writing, a man in total shock. But the Soviets were patient. They began a slow, careful, and brilliant psychological campaign. They didn't torture him, at least not physically. They talked to him. They brought in other captured German generals, men who had already seen the light and turned against Hitler. The most important of these was General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, another officer from Stalingrad. These men had formed a group with full Soviet backing called the National Committee for a Free Germany, and more importantly for Paulus, the League of German Officers. They sat with Paulus for hours, day after day. They didn't just feed him communist propaganda. They argued as German officers that Hitler had betrayed them, that the conflict was a crime, that Hitler's insane orders had needlessly sent hundreds of thousands of Germans to their doom. They argued that true patriotism, true loyalty to the German people meant ending the struggle to save what was left of their nation. But the thing nobody tells you is what finally broke him. It was a devastating two-part blow in the summer of 1944. First, the Soviets showed him in detail the evidence of the Nazi extermination camps. They brought in witnesses and showed him photographs. Paulus, like many in the military high command, had lived in a bubble of honorable warfare. The systematic industrial-scale horror was something he could no longer deny. Second, and far more personally, they delivered him news from Germany. On July 20th, 1944, a group of brave German officers had tried to end Hitler's life with a bomb. The plot failed. The Nazi regime cracked down with terrifying brutality, and they decided to make an example of Paulus. Because he had disgraced the army by surrendering at Stalingrad, his wife and children, who he had not seen in years, were arrested by the Gestapo. They were thrown into a concentration camp as political prisoners, their fate uncertain. This was the final turning point. Hitler had not only destroyed his army, he had personally, vindictively punished his innocent family for his failure. The ironclad loyalty that had defined Paulus's entire life snapped. He agreed to cooperate, and his cooperation was, to put it mildly, devastating. He immediately joined the League of German Officers. He began making radio broadcasts beamed directly to the German front lines. Soldiers huddling in their trenches in Italy and on the Eastern Front, men who had been raised to revere the Field Marshal of Stalingrad, suddenly heard his voice. He told them to lay down their arms, to disobey Hitler's criminal orders, and to surrender. To the Nazi high command, this was the ultimate act of treason, a dagger in the back from their most famous general. But his most shocking public moment was yet to come. In 1946, the world's attention was on a courtroom in Nuremberg where the top surviving Nazi leaders, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and others, were on trial for their terrible acts. The defense, led by the arrogant and defiant Göring, was claiming the Wehrmacht was just a professional army, that they were just following orders, and that the invasion of the Soviet Union was a preventative measure to stop a Soviet attack. The Soviet prosecutor called a surprise witness. The doors to the courtroom opened and in walked Friedrich Paulus. The room was stunned into absolute silence. The American and British judges stared. The defendants were visibly shaken. Göring's face reportedly turned white with rage. Here was a German Field Marshal, in a neat civilian suit, about to testify against his former comrades and his own country. Paulus spoke calmly, precisely, and methodically, like the professorish staff officer he had always been. He took apart the entire defense. He confirmed, as a high-level planner for Operation Barbarossa, that the invasion of Russia was an unprovoked, pre-planned act of aggression. He provided dates, operational names, and details that proved the German High Command knew exactly what they were doing from the beginning. When Göring tried to shout him down from the dock, Paulus simply looked at him and said he was testifying for the truth and for the future of the German people. Other German generals in the dock screamed traitor at him. He had become, in the eyes of his former nation, the ultimate traitor. But for the Soviets, he was the perfect propaganda tool. He was the reformed general, the man who had seen the error of his ways. After the trials, they didn't let him go. He was too valuable, and perhaps he now knew too much. He was kept for another 7 years in his comfortable dacha, living in total isolation, writing military analysis for the Red Army. He was a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Finally, in 1953, after Stalin's passing, he was released, but he wasn't sent home. He was sent to Dresden. A prisoner in plain sight. When Friedrich Paulus arrived in Dresden in October of 1953, he was a broken man. He was finally free, but he was in East Germany, a new country built on the Soviet model, a puppet state of his former captors. His family, his wife and children were in West Germany, the other side of the new Iron Curtain. He was forbidden to see them. He would never see his wife again. She passed away while he was still in Dresden. He was given the grand, sprawling villa on Pressstrasse, a car, a driver, and a generous pension. But it was all a lie, a carefully constructed stage. He was not a retiree. He was a prisoner in plain sight. The Stasi, East Germany's new and terrifyingly efficient secret police, took over his surveillance from the Soviets. They were, if possible, even more paranoid. They named his house Object Terrace. And to put it mildly, it was one of the most monitored houses in the entire country. You see, the Stasi were paranoid about him. Many people are crazy about the wow factor of Stasi surveillance, but the reality for Paulus was even stranger. They didn't just tap his phone, that was child's play. They had, according to later reports, over 48 hidden microphones planted inside the walls of the villa. They had agents posing as city utility workers who would climb the telephone poles just to use directional microphones to listen to him in the garden. They had cameras with telephoto lenses in an attic across the street. His driver was a Stasi major. His housekeeper was a Stasi informant who reported on his mail. The doctor who treated him was required to file reports on his psychological state. He had a bodyguard who was really his handler. He couldn't take a walk, buy a newspaper, or mail a letter without it being logged, copied, and analyzed. And what many overlooked was that Paulus was not a stupid man. He had been a general, a prisoner, and a star witness. He knew the game. He knew he was being watched, so he played the part. He was given a job as the head of the Military History Institute. He gave quiet, dull lectures at the East German Military Academy, talking about the criminal nature of the Nazi regime and the genius of Soviet strategy. He wrote articles for the state newspaper praising the new socialist government. He was the perfect, docile symbol of the new Germany. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. His health was failing, and fast. He had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. This brutal, incurable nerve disease slowly robs a person of their ability to move, to speak, to even breathe. But it leaves the mind perfectly, painfully clear. Paulus knew he didn't have much time left. He was in a race against his own body, and in his final 2 years, he began to write. Non-stop. The Stasi agents listening in their attic post nearby were confused. Their logs, which were later declassified, are filled with frantic notes. They heard him muttering to himself, pacing his study late at night. They heard the constant, furious scratching of his pen. He was writing something far more extensive than the simple, boring articles he was publishing. He seemed to be working with a new, frantic, secret energy. This is where the real mystery begins. Paulus knew the house was bugged. He knew his desk would be searched if he left. He knew his trash was collected and reassembled. So how was he writing thousands of pages of secret, explosive material? And where did he hide it? The theory is that he used the one thing the Stasi couldn't control: the past. The villa was an old pre-war mansion. It had quirks, old servant passages, and hollow spaces from a time before microphones and modern surveillance. He must have found the hidden compartment in his study, a relic from the original builders, and begun his secret work. Night after night, as his body grew weaker, as his hands began to fail him, he would write. He wasn't just writing a diary. He was building a case. He was writing his real testament, the one that condemned both Hitler and Stalin. He was writing about his capture, about the psychological manipulation, about his time in Moscow, and about the secrets he learned at the very heart of the Soviet system. He was writing the very Stalingrad Protocol that Hitler had forbidden, a document that proved he tried to save his men. He was a ghost in his own house, creating a paper trail that he hoped one day someone would find. He was in a desperate race against his own sickness, and against the Stasi agents listening just a few hundred feet away, logging the sound of his pen as just subject is writing and having no idea what truth he was putting to paper. He finished his work just in time. When he passed in February 1957, his secret was sealed in the wall, waiting. What the papers really said. When the Stasi agents broke open that hidden compartment, they found Paulus's true legacy, and it was a political nightmare for them. The documents were immediately seized, classified at the highest level, top secret state importance, and shipped to a special Stasi archive in Berlin. And for over 30 years, they were never spoken of again. Then, in 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall fell. The East German government, one of the most controlling in the world, crumbled in a matter of weeks. The Stasi's power evaporated. Its secret archives, miles and miles of files on millions of people, were thrown open. Historians and journalists and ordinary citizens rushed in, eager to find the truth, to read their own files, and to find the long-lost Paulus files. They found nothing. The files were gone. The wow factor is this: there were references to them. They found the original Dresden report, logging the discovery of object terrorist materials. They found the catalog number in the Berlin archive, but the shelf was empty. The files themselves had vanished. They had been professionally removed. This is where we have to ask the big questions. People watching this are looking for a mystery, and this is one of the biggest. Are we missing a key detail? What was in those files that was so dangerous that someone, either the collapsing Stasi or their Soviet masters, had to make sure they were never ever seen? The thing is, the theories are more disturbing than the known facts. The file's disappearance, more than its discovery, is the real story. Theory 1. The Stalingrad Protocol. This is the most popular theory. Paulus's secret log didn't just blame Hitler, it also contained damning details of his secret negotiations to surrender, which may have started weeks before it officially happened. It might have shown that Soviet marshals deliberately let the Sixth Army starve and freeze for 2 more weeks, rejecting an earlier, quieter surrender, all so they could have the massive propaganda victory of capturing a field marshal. This would have tarnished their great patriotic war narrative forever. Theory 2. The Moscow Blacklist. This theory is even darker. What if Paulus, during his 7 years inside the Soviet system, learned who the other high-level German traitors were? What if he had a list of German generals, politicians, and industrialists who were secretly Soviet agents during the conflict? Or even more explosively, what if he had a list of men who were now in power in West Germany? That kind of information would have been a Cold War game changer. The Stasi would have used it for blackmail, but the Soviets would have wanted it buried. What do you think was in those disturbing files? Was Paulus a traitor, a victim, or the only one who dared to write the truth? Let us know your theory in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden stories.